Emily had always felt at home in the wilderness. There was something comforting about the vastness of nature, the way the towering trees swallowed the noise of the outside world, leaving only the rustling of leaves and the occasional call of a distant owl. It was peaceful. It was untouched. And most of all, it was an escape from the chaos of real life. That was what she and Sarah needed, a break. A weekend away from deadlines, texts, emails, and the constant, suffocating hum of civilization. Sarah, always the adventurous one, had picked the location. Mt. Hood National Forest, a sprawling, remote stretch of Oregon wilderness with hundreds of miles of hiking trails, crystal-clear lakes, and dense evergreen forests. "This is perfect," Sarah had said as they drove up the winding road toward their campsite, her blonde ponytail swaying as she checked the GPS, far enough from people to be peaceful, but not so far that we can't get out if we need to. Emily had nodded, but there was something about how empty the road was that made her uneasy. It was mid-autumn, and most summer campers had packed up weeks ago, leaving the forest eerily vacant. Still, when they pulled into the small gravel lot near the trailhead and began the short hike to their chosen spot, the unease faded. The forest was beautiful, the kind of pristine beauty you only see on postcards. Golden leaves carpeting the forest floor, towering pine trees swaying gently overhead, and a cool, crisp breeze carrying the scent of damp earth and moss. They had picked a secluded clearing near a quiet creek, a little off the main path, but still accessible enough to return to the car quickly if needed. It was perfect. At least, it had seemed that way. By the time they had pitched their tent and gathered wood for a fire, the sun was dipping low, casting long shadows across the trees. The temperature had dropped, and the stillness of the forest became more noticeable. Sarah flopped down onto a log, stretching her arms. "Not bad, huh? We could survive out here if we had to." Emily chuckled. "Sure, as long as DoorDash delivers to the woods." They sat around the crackling campfire, roasting marshmallows and sipping from their flasks, the warmth of the flames keeping the creeping cold at bay. The sky had turned a deep, inky blue, stars blinking through the treetops. It was quiet, too quiet. Emily had always loved the outdoors, but there was something unsettling about this particular silence. There were no crickets, no distant rustling of small animals in the underbrush, no sounds of birds settling in for the night, just the crackling fire. Her skin prickled. She took a slow breath and glanced at Sarah, who was staring into the flames, oblivious. "Does it feel off to you?" Emily asked finally. Sarah frowned. "What do you mean?" Emily hesitated, then shook her head. "I don't know. It's just, I feel like we're being watched." Sarah snorted. "Dude, we're in the middle of a forest. We are definitely being watched. By like 50 raccoons and maybe a deer." Emily forced a laugh, but the feeling didn't go away. And then, a twig snapped in the distance. Emily froze, marshmallow stick suspended in midair. Sarah must have heard it too because she sat up straighter, eyes narrowing. The sound had come from beyond the firelight, deeper in the woods. Emily scanned the darkness. The trees stood like silent sentinels, their trunks blending into the shadows. Nothing moved. Probably an animal, she told herself. A coyote, maybe. Still, the hairs on the back of her neck stood on end. And then she saw it. A figure standing at the edge of the trees, barely visible in the flickering light of the fire. Emily's breath caught in her throat. It was a man. The stranger stepped forward, into the glow of the firelight. He was tall, broad-shouldered, wearing a worn-out Carhartt jacket and mud-caked boots. His face was obscured by the brim of his cap, but Emily could feel his eyes on them. He wasn't smiling, just standing there, watching. Sarah was the first to speak. Hey there." Her tone was casual, but Emily could hear the edge of caution in it. The man didn't respond right away. Then, in a slow, deliberate voice, he said, "Didn't think I'd see anyone else this far out." His tone was flat, emotionless. Emily's stomach twisted. Something about the way he said it, like he was disappointed to find them here. "Yeah, just a weekend trip," Sarah said, keeping her voice light. "Didn't think anyone else was around either." The man nodded slowly. He looked around their campsite, the tent, the fire, their backpacks. His gaze lingered on Emily's phone, which was lying next to her on a log. "You two out here alone?" he asked. Sarah didn't even hesitate. "Nope. Our boyfriends are on a hike. Should be back soon." The man didn't react at first. Then, his lips twitched. A flicker of something unreadable crossed his face. Emily's pulse quickened. He knew she was lying. For a few moments, no one spoke. The fire crackled between them. Then, suddenly, the man gave a slow nod and turned toward the trees. "Be careful out here," he murmured. "It gets real dark at night." And then he was gone. Emily exhaled a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. Sarah muttered, "What the fuck was that?" Emily shook her head, still staring at the darkness where the man had disappeared. "I don't know, but that was weird, right? Like, really weird." Sarah nodded, rubbing her arms against the cold. "Yeah, the way he asked if we were alone?" She shook her head. "Creepy as hell." Emily shivered, suddenly hyper-aware of how alone they really were. "We should leave," she said. "First thing in the morning." Sarah hesitated. "Yeah, maybe." Neither of them slept well that night. Sometime past midnight, Emily woke up. At first, she didn't know why. Then, she heard it. A twig snapping. Closer this time. She lay frozen, listening. Then, the sound of leaves crunching. Slow, deliberate. Her stomach clenched. Something, or someone, was outside the tent. Emily reached for Sarah, shaking her awake. "What?" Sarah began groggily, but Emily pressed a finger to her lips. Then, the tent zipper moved. Someone was trying to open it. Emily's heart slammed against her ribs. Sarah's breathing hitched. They both lay there, staring at the faint shadow right outside the thin fabric of their tent. And then, a low, whistling sound. A tune. Slow, purposeful. The same direction the man had gone. The zipper slid down another inch. And this time, it didn't stop. The sound of the tent zipper felt like it was going to split Emily's skull open. Her heartbeat thundered in her ears. The rhythmic whistling outside was still faint, but it was undeniable. A person was standing there, deliberately trying to get in. Sarah's eyes were wide, filled with the same terror Emily felt but didn't know how to express. Neither of them moved. The only sound in the tent now was their breath, shallow and ragged, and the occasional rustle of the wind in the trees. Emily's mind raced, her heart pounding in time with the whispers outside. Was it the man from earlier? The same man who had watched them from the shadows? Or had something more sinister followed them in? The zipper moved again. A small click as if someone were testing it, as if they were making sure the door was still secure. Emily's hand hovered above the knife in her backpack, but the cold, hard truth hit her like a ton of bricks. They weren't prepared for this. She felt completely vulnerable, completely exposed. She wanted to scream, to shout, to run, but she couldn't. "Not yet. Do you think it's him?" Sarah whispered, her voice barely audible. "I don't know," Emily replied, her voice trembling. "I don't know, but I don't think we should wait to find out." They had to act. Now, suddenly, a loud snap of a branch echoed from behind the tent, followed by scraping footsteps. The man, or whatever it was, wasn't just standing there. He was circling the tent. Sarah's face twisted in fear. "What do we do?" she hissed, panic rising in her voice. Emily didn't answer immediately. She had to think. They couldn't fight him. He had the advantage of being outside, and with no one else around, any attempt to scream for help would be futile. But they couldn't stay trapped either. "Get your shoes on," Emily said urgently. "We're running." Sarah nodded, but Emily could see the hesitation in her eyes. They both knew there was no guarantee they'd make it out unscathed, no guarantee that the night would end with them safe. Another movement from outside, the rustle of the trees. Emily grabbed the tent zipper, and before Sarah could respond, she yanked it open. The cold night air hit her like a slap in the face, but she didn't flinch. The smell of pine and the damp earth filled her lungs. Her eyes darted around, scanning the darkness. The whistling stopped, and then, in the pitch-black forest, a shape shifted. He stepped into the firelight, his face still hidden beneath the brim of his cap. The same eerie calm washed over him. His boots crunched loudly against the dry ground as he moved toward them, each step deliberate and methodical. His voice came out soft, almost murmured, like he was speaking to himself, yet clearly directed at them. "Not so quiet now, are we?" Emily froze. He was toying with them. Without thinking, her eyes darted toward the trees. They weren't alone anymore. Shadows seemed to crawl out from the trees. Two more figures, tall, almost spectral. One of them was dragging a heavy object behind him. Emily's heart stuttered. "Run!" she whispered, her voice shaking. Without another word, she grabbed Sarah's arm and pulled her toward the woods, away from the man and the two others who were closing in on them. Sarah didn't hesitate. They bolted. Through the trees, their legs moving faster than they ever had before, adrenaline surging through their veins. Behind them, they heard the footsteps follow, heavy, determined, but there was something in the air, something more than just the chase. It was like the forest itself was holding its breath, waiting for them to make a mistake. Emily glanced over her shoulder and saw the man. He was still following, but now there was something more in his gait, confidence. Like he knew they would break, like he was playing a game. The trees blurred around them as they ran, their feet stumbling over roots and rocks. The moon barely broke through the canopy, leaving them in near-complete darkness, except for the occasional flash of moonlight that illuminated the underbrush like flickers of light in the darkness. Emily could hear Sarah's breath, harsh and ragged beside her. She didn't dare look back now. She just had to keep running. But the distance between them and the stalker was shrinking. Faster. They needed to go faster. But their legs burned. The cold air cut through their lungs. They reached a clearing. Emily's heart sank. The path in front of them branched into two directions. One led downhill, toward the creek they'd passed earlier. The other led deeper into the woods, into a denser, more overgrown part of the forest. "What do we do?" Sarah panted, looking at Emily. Emily didn't know. Her mind raced, trying to process the options. The creek would lead them to the road, but it would also slow them down. The dense woods, on the other hand, might give them cover, but it would be hard to navigate. Before she could make a decision, a shadow moved across the clearing and the man appeared. He was closer now, not far. The dark figures behind him were still silent, but Emily could see them, watching them from the trees. They were cornered. "We can't outrun him," Sarah said, panic creeping into her voice. Emily's mind raced. There had to be something they could do. And then it hit her. "Up the trees!" Emily shouted. Without waiting for Sarah's response, Emily grabbed hold of the nearest tree and began scrambling up. Her heart was pounding, adrenaline rushing through her veins as her fingers found purchase on the rough bark. Sarah hesitated but followed. The climb was slow, their muscles burning from the effort, but they got high enough to see the stalker's movements below. The man below stopped, his eyes scanning the trees. His head tilted slightly to the side, as though he could sense where they were, but he didn't seem to know for sure. Emily held her breath. If they made any noise, they were dead. The silence in the forest seemed to stretch forever. The stalker turned away from the trees and started walking again. But then, his eyes flicked toward them. He saw them. He raised his head, and his lips curled into a slow, predatory grin. "We know where you are," he said, his voice as calm as ever. Emily's blood ran cold. "Time's running out," the man whispered. The air had turned ice cold, and the silence around them was suffocating. It was as if the entire forest had stopped breathing. Emily's heart hammered in her chest as she and Sarah clung to the thick branches, higher and higher, away from the man below. They could barely see him now, but his voice, low and steady, cut through the stillness like a predator savoring the chase. "We know where you are," he had said. The words echoed in her mind as Emily tried to steady her ragged breath. "Time's running out." Emily squeezed her eyes shut, trying to ignore the overwhelming sense of dread that crawled beneath her skin. She could hear the man walking beneath the trees, his heavy boots crunching against the leaves. He was trying to lure them down, to make them think they were safe. But he was playing with them. Sarah's trembling voice broke through Emily's thoughts. "What do we do now? We can't stay up here forever." Emily's fingers tightened on the tree's rough bark. The branches were wet from the previous night's rain, and she felt a chill creeping into her bones. We need to move. If we stay here, we'll be sitting ducks. Sarah nodded, her face pale under the faint moonlight. How far do you think we can get before he? Her words were cut off by a loud crack from below. The man had stopped walking. Emily's blood ran cold. She forced herself to quiet her breathing, every muscle frozen in fear as she strained to hear what was happening below them. For a long moment, nothing happened. The forest was eerily still. And then, a whisper, barely audible but unmistakable. I know you're up there. The man's voice was closer now, his words like ice-cold daggers in the quiet. Emily's stomach dropped. She didn't know how, but he knew. Somehow, he knew where they were. They had to move. Now, without another word, Emily slid down the tree, her fingers desperately grasping for purchase. Her feet touched the ground with a thud, and for a second, she thought her heart might stop altogether. She glanced up at Sarah, who had also begun her descent, but the branches were slick, and Sarah slipped, her foot catching a lower branch. Sarah, Emily hissed, reaching up to help her, but it was too late. The branch snapped, and with a cry, Sarah plummeted to the ground, her body crashing through the underbrush. Emily's heart lurched in her chest. Sarah, Emily whispered frantically. Before she could move, the man's voice came again, this time far too close for comfort. I knew you'd come down eventually. Emily's blood ran cold. She didn't dare move, didn't dare breathe, as she watched Sarah scramble to her feet, trying to push through the underbrush. But it was too late. The man was already on her. Emily's survival instincts kicked in. Without thinking, she pushed through the thicket, her legs screaming in protest as she ran toward Sarah. Her friend was already standing, looking over her shoulder in terror, but the man was getting closer, much closer. Sarah, move! Emily shouted, her voice breaking with urgency. Sarah turned and bolted, running with everything she had. Emily was right behind her, but she could feel the man's presence growing stronger, closer. They weren't fast enough. The branches of the trees seemed to close in around them, and Emily's mind screamed at her to find some kind of escape. There had to be something, anything to get them out of this nightmare. She glanced over her shoulder. The man was still following. The trees were becoming thicker now, their branches reaching out like grasping hands. Emily's chest burned from the exertion, and she could hear Sarah's gasping breath just ahead of her. But the worst part? The man wasn't just behind them. He was getting closer. The woods seemed to close in on them. The night, once tranquil and serene, now felt like a labyrinth, each turn only bringing them further into the jaws of their stalker. The distant thrum of Emily's heartbeat was the only sound that seemed to matter. And then, just when it seemed like they were out of options, Emily saw something. Through the thick trees, she spotted a small structure. Rusted, dilapidated cabin, its wooden walls darkened by years of neglect, but still standing tall against the wildness of the forest. Over there, Emily shouted. The cabin. Sarah's eyes widened, and she nodded, a look of desperate hope flashing across her face. They ran toward it, the cabin looming larger as they drew closer. They reached the door and pushed it open. To their surprise, the door creaked with little resistance, and they slipped inside, breathing heavily, barely able to stand. The cabin was empty, just a decaying shell, but at least it gave them a moment to breathe. The silence inside the cabin was broken only by the sound of their heavy breathing. Emily quickly closed the door, her fingers shaking as she turned the lock. But as she did, the floorboards beneath her feet creaked. A chill ran down her spine. It was too quiet now. They stood in the dim light filtering through the cracks in the walls, their eyes darting around the room. The cabin was old, its wooden beams cracked and weathered. Dust hung in the air, and the floor was covered in rotting wood and discarded debris. But there was one thing Emily noticed almost immediately. It smelled wrong. There was a strange chemical stench in the air, mingling with the musty decay. It was overpowering. What is that? Sarah asked, her voice shaky. I don't know, Emily replied, her hand instinctively reaching for the old, rusted axe that lay propped up in the corner. But I don't like it. For a moment, they just stood there, trying to catch their breath. But then, a voice from outside. I know you're in there. It was the man, and he wasn't far. He had found them. The door to the cabin began to creak slowly, like someone was trying to force it open. Emily's heart raced. They couldn't stay here. There was nowhere to hide, and if they stayed, the man would find them. But then, another sound. From the other side of the room, just out of the moonlight's reach, came a soft whisper. It wasn't the man. It was something else. A low, guttural voice came from the shadows. Get out of here. Emily's blood ran cold. The whispering voice in the shadows was like a dagger, cutting through the quiet of the cabin. Emily's blood ran cold, her heart hammering in her chest as she strained her ears, trying to make sense of the words. Get out of here. The voice was low, guttural, distorted by the dark corners of the room. It was human, but it wasn't. It didn't belong in the cabin with them. Emily felt her throat tighten, her limbs turning to stone. Every instinct in her body screamed at her to run, to escape before whatever it was in the shadows reached out and grabbed them. But they were trapped. The cabin had no windows, only the single, rotting door, which was now slowly being pried open. The man was outside, but that whisper, it was something else. Emily, what the hell is that? Sarah whispered, her voice trembling. Emily couldn't answer. She could only stare into the darkened corner, where the whispers grew louder, more urgent. They were no longer words. It was like someone, or something, was trying to warn them. The door gave a final groan, and then it was open. The man stepped inside. His form loomed in the doorway, silhouetted by the dim moonlight filtering through the cracks in the walls. Had a feeling you'd be hiding here, the man said, his voice calm. Almost too calm for what was happening. His gaze flicked over them, lingering for a moment too long on Sarah. Then, he took a step inside, one boot crunching against the floorboards. Emily's mind raced. She couldn't let him get any closer. They needed to move. Now, but as she made a move to stand, another noise sounded from the far corner, louder this time. A rustling, like something dragging along the floor. And then, from the shadows, something emerged. It wasn't human. It wasn't even alive in the way they understood it. It was a figure, tall, cloaked in rags that seemed to shift like mist. Its arms were unnaturally long, its face a blank, eyeless void, its body nothing but twisted, inhuman proportions. The air around it seemed to distort, like a haze or fog that smothered the room in a suffocating grip. The temperature dropped further, until Emily could see her breath in the freezing air. The man in the doorway didn't move. He simply watched as the figure took a slow, deliberate step toward them, its feet dragging across the floor. Emily felt a wave of nausea roll over her. She wasn't sure whether to scream or run. The figure was coming for them, and the man was just standing there, watching, waiting. Sarah, Emily hissed, her voice trembling. We need to go now. But Sarah didn't respond. She was staring at the figure in the corner, her mouth hanging open in shock. Before Emily could react, the man stepped forward, cutting off any path to escape. Not so fast, he said, his voice low, like a predator about to pounce. Emily's hand found the rusted axe, and she gripped it tightly, the cold steel digging into her palms. Get away from us, she said, forcing the words out through clenched teeth. But the man didn't flinch. Instead, his lips curled into that same chilling grin. You don't get it, he said, his voice almost too soft. This isn't just about you. You shouldn't have come here. As he spoke, the figure in the shadows took another step closer, its long arms reaching out toward them. Its fingers were like twisted vines, unnaturally long, with jagged, claw-like nails. Emily's breath quickened. This was it. Without warning, she swung the axe at the man, aiming for his head. But the moment she did, the air shifted. The man was gone. He was just gone. Before Emily could process what had happened, Sarah screamed. Emily whipped around. The figure, the thing in the corner, was no longer just standing. It was moving towards Sarah, its arms outstretched, ready to grab her. No, Emily shouted, throwing the axe at the creature. The axe missed. In that instant, Emily realized something. The man wasn't after them. He was trying to keep them here, to trap them. The real danger wasn't him. It was the thing that had emerged from the shadows. It had been waiting. Emily's mind raced as the figure drew closer, its twisted limbs reaching out like a predator closing in on its prey. Then, as if on instinct, Emily reached for the rusty lantern that hung near the door. She grabbed it, and in one swift motion, tossed it at the creature. The glass shattered with a deafening crash. For a moment, everything was silent. Then, the creature reacted. The fire inside the lantern flared up, catching the ragged cloth of the figure's body. The creature howled, a sound like cracking stone as the flames spread over it. But Emily didn't wait. She grabbed Sarah's arm and pulled her toward the door, where the man was nowhere to be seen. They ran. Fast. They didn't stop. The world outside was a blur of trees and darkness, but they didn't care anymore. The air was filled with the sharp sting of smoke, and the screams of the creature echoed behind them. They couldn't look back. They stumbled, dropped to their knees, their legs burning, but they didn't stop. They ran. The world around them was nothing but the distant glow of flames. And then, through the trees, a light. A car's headlights. Emily and Sarah collapsed, gasping for breath, as a vehicle skidded to a stop in front of them. The door swung open. It was the sheriff, finally. "Are you girls okay?" he asked, his voice calm, but Emily could see the concern in his eyes. Emily nodded, but her mind was still racing. The creature was still out there, somewhere in the woods. But they were alive, and that was all that mattered. As they got into the sheriff's car, Emily turned one last time to look at the forest. In the distance, she could see the glowing embers from the fire. But there, at the edge of the trees, stood a figure. It was the man. He wasn't smiling anymore. His eyes were locked on her as she sat in the car, watching her like a predator. Then, in the blink of an eye, he was gone.